Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone. All right, so I just wanted to do a bit of an introduction to the Drugs Awareness Week that we're running. The point of the Awareness Week is to present a bit of an alternative to the usual rhetoric around just say no, and to obviously include that, but to have a focus on harm reduction as well, to be inclusive of people who use drugs, people who don't use drugs together. So I thought might be helpful at the beginning was to just have a chat about what is a drug and what is a drug user, because I think it's things that we think that we know, but when we really look into it, it can be quite telling. So I wanted to start by asking who is a drug user. Thank you all for your drawings. I've asked people in the audience to make a little bit of a drawing of what I think a typical drug user is. So. Right, so I wanted to ask who a typical drug user is. So, a lot of the things I've got are great. They're mostly male, which I think is quite telling. And a lot of them have a joint in their hand, or holding a syringe, or have like bags in their eyes. And I guess I just wanted to have a bit of a chat about, well, actually I've got an old lady that's smoking cannabis, so that's quite out of the ordinary. A lot of people have wide eyes, so I guess I just wanted to have a bit of a chat about where these ideas come from. And is it from maybe personal experiences of meeting people who use drugs, or is it from other things? Because I think it can come from a lot of different sources. So the first one I wanted to chat about was media representations of who is a drug user. Typically in the media, what is going to be represented as a drug user are things that would be newsworthy. So a lot of the time it'll be younger women who are quite vulnerable, or people who are seen as being productive members of society. So in the case of Leah Betts is probably the most famous one. She's a young girl who died from supposedly ecstasy use in the 90s, and it was widely publicized after she passed away. Her parents were a part of that because they wanted to demonstrate how drugs can be harmful to young people. So they kind of put that picture on those billboards, if that's correct. What we actually found out afterwards was that she died because she drank too much water when she was under the influence of ecstasy, likely because she was overheating in a club environment. And certainly that could have been maybe preventable or reduced if she was given more education around not over drinking when you're under the influence of ecstasy, those kinds of things. But again, that will be like a typical representation of a drug user in the media. It's like a young, vulnerable girl who's like had a critical incident or has died after misuse of like ecstasy. Another one that's quite common is showing like politicians that use cocaine. I think there's one of George Osborne as well, but like Kate Moss just like showing kind of celebrities and how they use cocaine and kind of glorifying how it's maybe a bit of an expensive substance to be using. The other kind of misrepresentation of a drug user in the media is how legal highs are quite popular with young people, which they are, but there's a lot of focus in the media around that. I don't know if any of you remember, for instance, when mephedrone was a big thing and that came out, there was like a lot of things about meow meow in the media, and I think just tends to be the typical thing. And there's also like a Liverpool ace Sterling on hippie crack days before a game, so kind of showing people who again are supposed to be responsible members of society as being an athletic and who are turning to drugs. And these are the kinds of representations that you'll have of a typical drug user in the media. So I think maybe a lot of the drawings you did, not all of them, but a lot of them kind of feed into like that representation that you get. So I wanted to talk about popular culture as well. So we've got the media, and then we have popular culture. So these images that we have just from mostly films and music. So I put the Beatles because they look like they're on drugs. But also there's like train spotting. There's not a very nice picture of Uma Thurman, but this is Uma Thurman in that famous scene in Pulp Fiction where she's like overdosing on cocaine and they like inject her with adrenaline, which is not what you're supposed to do in that situation, by the way. But it's just these images that are propagated in our brain when we think about who is a typical drug user. It's hard to, it's definitely, I think, these play into like what we perceive to be a typical drug user, if that makes sense. Cool. So this is, when I was thinking about doing this presentation, I literally typed the words drug user on Google Images, and this is what showed up. These are all of the images that come up when you type drug user, and I just thought that was quite telling because I think a lot of it depicts what you would see as a typical drug user as people that are, you know, doing it in quite a risky manner, so like using in dirty environments or using quite dangerous methods of administration, like injecting or like snorting with a note. And then this kind of typical thing of like showing someone who supposedly before they were a drug user and after they were a drug user, without necessarily thinking about the social things. Did you have a question, Luke?
Yeah, I was going to say, again, if you're taking out typical pictures, do you think there's over a representation of BAME people, Black, Asian, ethnic minorities? So that
Yeah,
one.
absolutely. I would say that as well. So again, it's quite telling. And then kind of, I think homelessness is also implied in a lot of things. Do you think anyone else has anyone else picked out any things that kind of show up on being a typical drug user?
Well, then again, the word actually says they're addict.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just not to say that this is what a typical drug user is, but if you think about how these images are pumped into our brain on a daily basis, it's obviously going to feed into what we perceive as being a drug user. So given that, obviously these people are using drugs, but I thought we'd look at the wider picture and maybe think about like other people who are drug users. So I've put these people because they're all using drugs at the moment, and I'll have a little chat about that afterwards, but I think it's important that we like interpret drugs in a broader sense than illicit substances, and particularly things like heroin and cocaine, or ecstasy in the case of Leah Betts. So it's a bit controversial, but I wanted to put a woman on the screen, so I've put the Queen. She's drinking tea, which is caffeine, and it is a stimulant, and I'll go into that a bit later. Obama having a cigarette, again, like that's definitely a drug. George Clooney's having some coffee, Nigel Farage is having a pint, and this is the president of Bolivia who is speaking at the UN. He used to be a cocoa producer, is that correct? And he actually did a speech at the UN on drug policy and the cultural significance of growing coca in his place of origin versus what we perceive to be cocaine usually. And at the end of his speech, he took the coca leaf out of his mouth and said, actually, I've been using drugs this whole time, but none of you noticed. And I just thought that was quite interesting. So these are like quite well-regarded people, but when we think of a typical drug user, we don't necessarily think of these people. So I guess what I wanted to do was hopefully just like challenge a little bit when we think about who is using drugs. And obviously none of you put George Clooney in here, but some of them were quite good, so thanks guys. Does anyone have any questions about that before I move on, or? No, that's fine. All right, so I want to talk about what is a drug a little bit. So this is the drugs wheel, which is a quite broad spectrum of, it basically lists like the different effects that various drugs can have. So I thought it might be a helpful exercise to kind of figure out where drugs fit on each thing. So there's different categories, I'll go through them all. There's stimulants, so that would be things that make you feel a little bit like up and alert. So there's like empathogens, so things that make you feel like feelings of being loved up or warm or connected with others. Psychedelics, where you have it's like a tripper basically, where you have like a spiritual connection or heightened senses like hallucinations, or like panic and distress according to your psychological state. We've also got dissociatives, so those are things that make you feel disassociated from the world and we have a bit of like an out-of-body experience. Cannabinoids, which make you feel a bit like stoned and calm, if that makes sense. And then we've got depressants, so those would be things that would like slow down your breathing or make you feel a bit like short-term confidence, but also kind of loss of consciousness or sleepiness, those kinds of things. And then we've got opioids, so those would be like pain relief and things that make you feel like kind of like you're in a bubble, so a bit like warm, but equally you'll have things like withdrawal from opioids. Does anyone have any questions about that?
What sort of things are?
Can you guys read?
The depressants. What sort of things? What's alcohol? And what? Okay.
So I thought I'd go through it, and if you guys want to shout out where you think they fit on the categories, just as it's a bit of a tricky one, but sometimes they're like several ones, but I thought it might be helpful. So I thought this one's quite obvious, but it's a big bud. Where do you think this one goes?
Cannabis.
Yeah. Cool. All right, we've got this one. What do you guys think this one is?
LSD.
Sorry?
LSD? What does that know?
Yeah, so where would you put LSD on the drugs wheel? Yeah.
Yes, are any of them both?
Sorry?
Were any of them both?
Are any of those both? Well, I think maybe with cannabinoids, like, it might be a bit of a stimulant sometimes, just because of the effects it can have, particularly for people who experience anxiety or panic attacks when they take particularly like high-grade cannabis. It could actually be a stimulant. Would you agree with that?
I think it's cannabis is also weird and psychedelic.
Yeah.
She's a stimulant.
So it could be a psychedelic as well if you experience like more mild auditory or visual hallucinations at the same time. I don't know if you can read this. This is Buckfast. Where would you guys put Buckfast?
Isn't it
Stimulant.
Yeah, so it's both. So because it's got caffeine in it, it's a stimulant, but because it's alcohol,
What is it called?
it's called Buckfast.
Alright, I don't even know what that is.
It's from Scotland, like from Glasgow, I think.
It's been like involved in loads of crime, doesn't it? It's like because it's got really, really high amount of caffeine in it and like loads of alcohol.
So it's like kind of like a Jaeger bomb. It's
Yeah,
not
it would be like if
stimulation.
you have a vodka Red Bull, you're
Yeah.
taking a stimulant, but you're also taking a depressant. So it's having those like mixed messages and how your body and heart responds to it. So I'm gonna put it like in the middle, kind of. All right. Do you guys know what these are?
Pills.
Yeah. Of
Ecstasy.
cool. Where would you put ecstasy on the?
Stimulants.
But also
pathogen.
pathogen.
Yeah, so it'd be between the two. So with ecstasy, you experience like feelings of being up because it is kind of similar to like amphetamines and other things. But then you also have feelings of empathy, so like compassions. Cool. All right, these nasty buggers. Where would you put them?
It's kind of like a stimulant, but not really.
I would say it's a stimulant, unless anyone would like to say someone
It's
else.
also, isn't it like a depressant as well? Wait, oh wait, no.
I just stimulant.
It's
I wouldn't say
stimulant as
just
well.
stimulant because it's the whole thing of the relaxing feeling. Like, it's, I mean, for example, if you're anxious, it sort of dumbs down the senses. Like,
So what I would say about that is, for instance, if you're really craving a cigarette, you might be going through withdrawal, so it might be more associated with that than it would the feeling of like relaxation. It would be more like the kind of short-term relief that you would get from withdrawal symptoms from nicotine.
what happens if you're just having a really stressful day? So it's not necessarily withdrawal. Like you've had your normal amount of cigarettes, and then you just have a really shit time, and you take cigarettes. Then is that still the same thing? It's just
Well, then in that case, it
Or-
might be a depressant as well. I guess it's open to
The
it.
class of the drugs is based on the mechanism of action in your body.
okay.
And it does have a stimulant effect on your body, but then I guess the way you then
Process
perceive
it.
the enjoyment of it may then bring relaxing effects.
Nicotine was some kind of opiate-like effect,
Yeah.
or at least like nicotine receptors are involved in opiates.
It's complicated. I think none of them are like technically just one. It's,
But mostly stimulant.
yeah.
Cool. Right, so this is a brown powder. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, so a bit of heroin. Where would you put heroin on the drugs wheel? Opiates, yeah. So I would put it between opiates and depressants, right? So if you take, it's obviously is an opiate and you'll experience like withdrawal symptoms, but also a feeling of being like warm and enveloped, but it's also a depressant, so it slows down your breathing. So if you take it with other depressants like alcohol or benzodiazepines, which are like Valium, it can be quite dangerous and you can go into respiratory depression. So I would put it between the two, if that makes sense. Nigel Farage's favorite drink, where would you put it?
Depressants.
Yeah?
Kind of got to get that one out, yeah.
As I'm putting them on, you're getting like less and less clues of the text as well. All right, cool. This could be several things, but what do you think this is?
Can't see.
Yeah, cocaine?
Okay.
Where would you put cocaine on it? Cool. So this would be like in contrast to MDMA, which would be both a stimulant and an empathogen. Cocaine would just be a stimulant. All right, we'll do a few more. So I just wanted to put this one as well.
Caffeine stimulant.
Yeah, stimulant as well. Cool.
So sorry for going back to bring one out like that, but
No.
is there anything that's just purely an empathogen?
Would any of you like to answer that?
I'd say maybe class MDMA as purely an empathogen, because I think technically an empathogen is both a stimulant and a psychedelic. Like MDMA is slightly psychedelic, but it's also a stimulant, so it's like it's like you've taken a bit of the psychedelic, a bit of the stimulant.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's true, but that's what I think.
Cool. And this one, do you guys know what this one is? So this is like nitrous oxide, what they called hippie crack in the media representation.
Dissociative?
What would you say it's dissociative?
I'd think that, but yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. But then I would also put it between dissociative and psychedelic, just because you can get mild, again, like visual and auditory hallucinations when using it.
Is that like laughing gas?
Yeah. Cool. So I guess what I wanted to show with this is that when we think about what is a drug, I think there tends to be a lot of rhetoric around when we think about what is a typical drug user, when we think what is a drug, we tend to think of kind of the drug users we discussed before and the drugs we discussed are usually like, you think illicit drugs because of the word drug. But if we talk about like substances more generally, I would say that all of these are drugs. And obviously the legal status just changed, but if you think about how like certain legal substances are in a similar category or in the same category to illegal substances, I think it can be a little bit arbitrary sometimes to like disassociate between the two. So for instance, the fact that like, I don't know, the fact that like benzodiazepines would be a depressant and alcohol is also depressant, but like if you use benzodiazepines as prescribed, they're illicit, but if you divert them and use them, then suddenly they're an illicit substance. And I think it's maybe helpful to have just a bit of like a wider perception when we talk about what is a drug. So I guess I just wanted to start the session by like putting the idea out there so that when we talk about drugs more generally for the rest of the week, we kind of like challenge ourselves to think a little bit more broadly. Particularly, we're doing a session on like legal highs tomorrow, and I think I did want to discuss that more broadly, as a lot of legal highs tend to be kind of used as like an umbrella term, when in fact they're just as wide-ranging, if not more, than traditionally illegal substances. So yeah, before I like promote the rest of the week, does anyone have any questions? Do they want to add anything to that? No? Thanks, cool. Well, in that case, I think that's us. What we'll be doing the rest of the week is I'm doing a session coming up on debunking myths, so we'll be talking about like common misconceptions about drugs and drug users, which we kind of touched a bit on today. Tomorrow we'll be talking about what is a legal high. Then Jess Bradley from Action for Trans Health will be exploring the relationship between drugs, sex, sexuality, and sexual health. On Thursday, our Newcastle chapter is going to be discussing the presence of adulterants and club drugs more generally, and then new initiatives in drug testing around the world. On Friday, we'll be having Kirsty from Lease come and talk about drugs and our rights, so that we can all be more knowledgeable about our rights in relation to drug use and other issues. And then at the end of Friday, we'll have law enforcement against prohibition who will come and discuss recent decriminalization for possession measures in County Durham. So I hope you all come to that.